Well, welcome folks. Thanks for coming along, and thanks for George for providing the venue. And as George said, it's great to have such a wonderful cross-section of educators here to attend our second guest lecture in the You Imagine's new series called We Imagine. This actual topic we're looking at is data. We're looking at the broader issues with regards to data and how it relates to learning, and thus the We Imagine data. We're actually live streaming this event, so I hope everyone's smiling. And we're actually trying to encourage more engagement beyond a face-to-face group with this series, including our hello to any of our CSU academics and community who are on other campuses at the moment, and certainly hello to any of our international guests. I know we had a few of those on Monday coming into the live stream as well. We're actually using a hashtag, which is hashtag We Imagine Data. So if you'd like to share what you're thinking and what you're learning during this session, please feel free to tweet it out to the wider world. We're also using just the generic hashtag of learning analytics, so anyone who's into that, you probably live and breathe searching that hashtag. And if you'd like to follow what we are doing at You Imagine with regard to our We Imagine series for data, which is over the next 4 to 5 weeks, we're actually doing it in partnership with CSU's Adaptive Learning and Teaching Services team, who are also here this evening. So great to have the whole team here, given that they're multi-campus. They've come from 3 different campuses. So you can just follow us on Twitter at YouImagine_CSU. For those people on live stream, we're Tim Claptor, who is our innovation technology leader. He will be sharing a URL with you in the chat, which will send you to a set of Bridget slides, so you can actually follow the slideshow as we go. And I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Lynn Hay. Now that I've got through all the business. Yeah, I'm Lynn Hay. I'm the Online Learning Innovation Leader with You Imagine. And so Tim and I collaborate on a number of things. This is our first journey into our We Imagine series, so we're looking forward to sharing that journey with you guys. So I'm going to hand over to Cass Colburn, who is the manager of our Analytics and Learning and Teaching Services, to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Let's hand that to. Yeah. Hi. It's actually a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Rebecca Ferguson, both to Charles Sturt University, but also to the Wagga community. Rebecca, I've known of Rebecca for many years. About 4 or 5 years ago, I somehow landed up in this field called learning analytics, and the first part was to actually work out what it was. And Rebecca is highly published in this space, both from a very empirical research and theoretical foundation, but as much from a practical and pragmatic stance as well, which was so helpful and valuable to me. And since then I've had the opportunity to meet with Rebecca. Rebecca is a senior lecturer at Open University in UK. She's also a senior fellow with the Higher Education Authority in UK. But of particular interest here, I think, is actually the other experiences that Rebecca has. So she's on the International Executive, and has been for a number of years, for the Society of Learning Analytics Research, which is the peak body for learning analytics. She's also been involved in multiple European funded projects, most recently the Learning Analytics Community Exchange, and also she's just connected with so many people in the broader learning analytics space. So welcome. Thank you. And I'll hand you over.
So today I'm not going to be talking to you about specific types of learning analytics. I'm going to be talking to you about the possibilities around learning analytics. And I'm going to give a talk in 3 parts. The first part is aimed at you, those of you in the audience who haven't really encountered learning analytics before, just a sort of brief grounding in learning analytics. Those of you who know about learning analytics already can just sit and feel smug through that bit. And then I'm going to talk about 2 works we've done about the future of learning analytics, where this might be going. And the idea there is to stimulate you to think about what if this might work at my institution, and why might this not work at my institution, and why. So to give you some ideas to throw around and think about. So starting off with what is learning analytics, this is the definition which the Society for Learning Analytics Research came up with for its first conference, the 2011 conference. And you can see the first part of it is about data, but the second part of it is what we are doing with that data. It's about understanding and optimising learning and its environments. And of course, in order to improve learning, we improve teaching, so that is implicit within that it's working with educators, it's working with learners. And I've highlighted there the word optimising, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So another way of talking about this is in terms of it helps us to find patterns in the data, to make sense of those patterns in the data, so we can use them to help learners and to improve learning. And the reason I've used this picture here is because this image of footsteps on the beach gives us a sort of image of what we are doing with data. We are working with traces that our learners and our educators leave behind, and then we are trying to make sense of those traces to decide what to do next. But if we look at these traces in the sand, we can get a sense of how many people were there and roughly what they were doing. But we don't really understand exactly what we were doing. We don't know if they're going to have paddle or if they just went out into the wild blue yonder and were never seen again. We don't know about that. And if you think again about the analogy of a beach, you know, if we collected data about a beach, we might say we found out how much rubbish there is on this beach, and that is data. But if we were doing analytics around it, we might think about, well, where is all that rubbish collected, so we can put trash cans there and we can improve the beach for everybody. And that's the sort of thing we're doing with learning analytics. It's not about the data, it's about what we are doing with that data. So holding on to the theme of what learning analytics is, I just thought I'd take you through, this was an action research study done by Annie Dykhoff a few years back, looking at why learners and educators use analytics. And some of these things may be obvious, and then some of these things you might not have thought of. Things about monitoring activities and their own learning process. A lot of learners are very interested in comparing their activity with those of others, but some find that very positive, some find that quite a negative process to engage in. It can increase awareness and reflection and self-reflection, but of course we know those aren't naturally occurring processes. Those are processes that we have to support learners with, we have to support educators with those. So if we want learners to use data to reflect, we have to encourage them and help them to do that. We can use them around discussion, we can do it around learning behaviour, but really these bottom ones are the ones we want to think about around learning to learn and around actually learning. Now if you move across to what educators are doing, a lot of the things that educators are doing with learning analytics are what educators have always done. Right? Educators have always monitored the learning process. We've always been interested in what students are doing. We've always been interested in identifying the problems and helping out with the problems. But data helps us to go a little bit further, perhaps to find those early indicators for success that we wouldn't have spotted in the first place, perhaps to find those early indicators that things are going wrong for a student that we wouldn't have been able to do so before. And particularly for those of us teaching at a distance who haven't got that face-to-face, day-to-day contact with students, and we're sort of waiting for them to hand in their assessment before we know what's happening. Learning analytics can give us that head start in saying, no, these students aren't engaging, why not? Again, increasing awareness. Something we've realised at our university is that although we encourage our students to reflect, we often don't have time to reflect ourselves. We lead really busy lives as educators. So again, if we want to do that with our learning analytics, we've got to build in opportunities for it. We've got to think about how we can use these to intervene, assist, advise and assist. They're not things that happen automatically. We've got to decide what we want to do. So those are some of the uses. I thought I'd just talk you very briefly through 3 forms of analytics to give you an idea of the range of learning analytics. So the first one I've got here is perhaps the best known example of learning analytics, especially if you came to the field early. Course Signals at Purdue University in the US was the one which really gave people the idea that learning analytics can work and can have good achievements. So this brought together data about students and what they were doing, and then it gave them a sort of traffic light system. So if the students got a green traffic light, it's like, things are going really well, you're on track, don't worry about it, just keep doing what you're doing. Amber, things are going a little bit wrong. Here are some suggestions for what you can do. And red, you've gone off track. But again, here are suggestions for what you can do. And they showed that using these appeared to raise grades and raise retention. Now since then, those figures have been challenged. I'm not going to say those are definite things, but this is really a key idea around learning analytics. And that's the idea of a sort of dashboard of where students are and where they're going is probably the most obvious example of learning analytics. But to take it in another direction, this is a tool which was developed in British Columbia and in Australia. If you've not worked with network diagrams before, the red blobs all represent individuals and the black lines represent connections between those individuals. And if you've not worked with a network diagram before, they can look a bit like just a pile of lines. So some of these are got blue rings around to draw some attention. So over here, we've got some students who aren't connected to anybody. So this is discussion forum data. Now, that may be okay in some discussion forums. It might be a question and answer forum. If they haven't got any questions, they don't need to be in the forum. However, if this is a set of data about a collaborative activity, these are students that you would need to worry about. Again, you've got some students out on the edge here who are only really very peripherally connected with what's going on. And usually you can bet in this sort of discussion that somewhere in the middle, I haven't got this isn't mine, so I don't know which, the tutor's probably somewhere in the middle. So these people probably aren't talking to the expert, they're probably just talking to 1 or 2 people. So you might be worrying about them. But you might be happier about these people right in the middle who are talking to everyone, sharing ideas. It's going to depend what you were trying to do with that discussion forum, whether you were happy with that or not. So one of the things they used this for in Canada was visualising different sorts of conversations and then feeding it back to the teachers. So there was one group, they said, we've looked at this and we've found that the teacher is answering the questions of all the high-performing students, but isn't answering the questions of the low-performing students. So they went to the teacher and said, what's happening here? And the teacher said, well, the low-performing students are asking such easy questions. We thought the other students would answer them, and we wanted to get the other students involved, so we left those. But in fact, what happened, what this sort of diagram showed, was that the low-performing students were just being left alone. Nobody was answering their questions at all. And so by looking at this sort of visualisation, you could change what the teacher was doing, how effectively that was happening. So I'll just give you a third example of learning analytics, just to give you a third example of how you can take this. This is an example from the Open University. This is an informal learning tool we have called iSpot. And the idea with iSpot is it's about wildlife identification. So anybody can take a picture of some bit of wildlife they've encountered and go to iSpot to find out what it is. And other people on the iSpot platform will help them to identify it. It's incredibly successful. People tend to get a good result within about an hour, typically. So these are a couple of pictures that I put up. This is an insect that I've never seen an insect like this. What's it like? And you can't read this over the other side, but somebody over here said, oh, well, it's a speckled bush cricket, I think, and told me a bit about why. But people couldn't quite decide what sort of a bush cricket it was. I got different examples. So because it's not a formal education platform, it's informal, how, as a novice, do I come in and judge who is giving me the right sort of answer, who is giving me the wrong sort of answer? And the analytics of the platform are what help me to do that. So you get analytics points on the platform. So if you come in as an expert, you're an accredited expert, you join the platform, you'd get a symbol which says you're an expert in that area. So if you're an expert in fish, you get a little fish. If you're an expert in fungi and lichens, you get a little toadstool. Right? Because of course, if you're an expert in fish, you could be telling people rubbish about mushrooms because you don't know anything about mushrooms. You don't know about all sorts of wildlife. But you also get social points about how much of you engage with the platform, and you get ones about how many correct identifications have you given. And correct identifications are the ones which an expert has agreed with. So by looking at all these little symbols, I can say, oh, well, the person who gave that answer is the person who's an expert, is the person who's been consistently giving good answers. So I can rely on them more than I can rely on other people. So that's another way of going about analytics and using the data within a system. So that's the introduction to learning analytics for those of you who haven't encountered it before. So I'm going to move forward to looking to the future of learning analytics. So if you've just joined the learning analytics field, we're zooming ahead. That's what's happened so far. What's the next story? Why are we looking forward already? I mean, we've only had learning analytics since 2011. Why are we bothering to think ahead? Why are we not just consolidating what we've got? Well, one of the reasons, obviously, is we are preparing students for a future which is going to be slightly different to things today. It's not just going to be the jobs that are different, everything about society is going to be slightly different. So we need to be thinking about how our learning analytics interact with that. But we've also got to think about the time it takes to develop and deploy learning analytics. It's not that I can say, oh, well, I've had a great idea for learning analytics, can you just roll that out tomorrow? Because of course you can't. We've got to discuss it. We've got to agree at a strategic level. We've got to think about where the data's coming from. Somebody's got to define an algorithm. Then you've got to pull the algorithm to pieces, say, oh, it didn't work, let's try it again. Then you've got to pilot it with a cohort, and you've got to do it for some time. Then you look at your pilot, and things went a bit wrong, so you pilot it again. Right? And you may be 4 or 5 years down the line. So when we design learning analytics now, we're designing learning analytics for the future. So if we look back, say if we look back 10 or 12 years, if we were designing learning analytics then, what would we have been doing? So we wouldn't have designed learning analytics for smartphones, because none of us had smartphones then. But we'd be designing them now, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be designing them for social media and looking at what people are doing on Facebook and Twitter, because we didn't really have that then. Everybody was on MySpace, and you wouldn't really be interested in them learning on MySpace. And we wouldn't be looking at MOOCs, because there was no such thing as a MOOC. And of course now we're looking at MOOCs all the time. But if we had done some future thinking, if we'd looked at what was going on in the academic space, we'd have said, well, we've never heard of iPhones, but we have heard of mobile learning, and we can see that mobile learning is a coming thing, and we can see the possibilities. So we might design analytics there. We don't know about social media so much, but we do know about network learning, and we understand the possibilities there. We don't know about MOOCs, but we do know about the new theory of connectivism, which is emerging, and we can see how that might apply to education. So we can begin to do the forecasting, which helps us to develop the analytics we need. Now, when we're developing analytics, a question we really need to think about is what are we trying to achieve? There's no point just saying we have got a lot of data, hey, let's analyse it, because that's not necessarily going to get us to optimising learning, and what we want to do is optimising learning. So if we think about what we're trying to achieve, this is something which institutions and countries and groups of countries think about. So I've been involved in European projects. European projects are all focused on where is Europe going with education and training. This is where Europe thinks it's going with education and training. It's got some priority areas. And when we do educational research and educational development projects, they ask us how we are addressing these things. Now you can see the first one really aligns nicely with learning analytics. It's all about digital and open and innovative, and we go, yeah, right, tick 1 for learning analytics, hurrah. But then we go on to strong support for teachers and trainers and school leaders. Well, of course, we hope our learning analytics are doing that. But how do we prove that they're doing that? And are they really doing that? Do we check? How do we develop learning analytics for lifelong learning when we're based in one institution? How do we take that on to another institution? How do we build the connections? And how do we do these much more difficult things around learning analytics for employability and the promotion of civic competencies? And when we know where we're going, we can begin to ask the questions about how we deal with this. Now, I don't know how much you keep up with the politics of what's going on in Europe, but you may be aware that Britain has made a rather crazy decision. So we may be moving away from those ideals. These are the aims that I found around our leading parties. This is what the Conservative Party said it would like to achieve with education. Rather more difficult things to do with learning analytics, how we conceptualise character and do something around learning analytics. I'm really hoping we don't have to find that out. But if we do, we need to know where education as a whole is going so that we can think about where we are going. Now, of course, you don't have to worry about what Europe's doing and what the UK is doing, but you may have to worry about what is happening here in Wagga Wagga. How are you developing learning analytics which help your students to live well? What would a learning analytic look like, which is about making the world worth living in? How can you achieve that? Or how can you achieve the things which are moving you towards that? Thinking about making things accessible, making things effective, about recognising good practice in learning and teaching. So before you really set up a major learning analytics program, you need to be thinking about what you're trying to achieve. And one of the things you might be trying to achieve is what your institution or your state or your country is trying to achieve. But one of the things you might also be trying to do is you might be asking people on your staff, when you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, what is the thing that really worries you? Because everybody on your staff will have some nightmare scenario that wakes them up at 4 in the morning. Can learning analytics help to deal with that, rather than doing something like adding a dashboard that might not be very useful to them? So thinking about the big questions, the big strategy going forward. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of projects that I've been involved with which have thought about how we can take learning analytics forward. And one of them was the Learning Analytics Community Exchange project, which was a big European project about driving learning analytics forward in the area. And we were sort of bringing together different sectors, we were bringing together resources. This is our home web page. It's got lots of resources on. If you're looking for resources around learning analytics, do let me point you at thelaceproject.eu. But one of the things we were charged with doing was looking to the future. How are learning analytics going to develop? How should Europe react to this? And the way that we did that was through a policy Delphi. Now, the researchers among you may have been involved in Delphi studies in the past. A Delphi study gets expert views and tries to distill them down to one expert opinion. A policy Delphi is almost exactly the opposite. A policy Delphi gets as many expert opinions as it possibly can, to inform decision making in the future. So that's what we were interested in doing. Talking to experts, talking to practitioners, talking to learners about where will learning analytics go in the future. We did that through surveys and workshops and focus groups. But of course, if I came up to any one of you in the room and said, I've got a survey here, tell me about how learning analytics is going to develop in the next 10 years, you'd go, okay, I won't do that survey. That's too difficult. I can't come up with an answer straight away. So we developed some provocations, some directions in which learning analytics could go in the next 10 years. Not directions in which we necessarily wanted them to go, or thought they were definitely going to go, but some to make them think. And we said, do you think this is desirable? Do you think this is feasible? And what would it take to make it happen? So I'll talk you through those 8 provocations so that you can think about, well, do you think they're desirable? Do you think they're feasible? Do you think they need to happen on your campus or in your area? When we presented them, they were sort of 100, 200 words. I'm not going to give you very wordy slides, but I'm just going to give you the sort of headline ideas around them. And if you want to read the full report, there's a full report on the Visions of the Future project, and I will put these up on SlideShare so you can grab things from them if you want to. So the first provocation about learners being monitored by their learning environment. And we know that increasingly we are monitored by our environment. You know, we've got a thermostat over there which is monitoring what's going on. I don't know about this room here, but we've certainly got rooms at our university where the lights are paying attention to if we're moving about, and if we stop moving about, all the lights go out. Really irritating. But we've got more and more possibilities for using these data sources. So I was at RMIT earlier in the week. RMIT are using their heat sensors to work out the occupancy of lecture theatres, so they can tell you how many people were in any given lecture at any given time. Can't tell you who was there, but they can tell you by the heat sensors how many bodies went in and how many bodies came out, and they're using that there. So is that something you'd be interested in, or do you think, well, really, that's a step too far? We don't think that's the analytics we want to go with. And from another perspective, around personal data. So I'm wearing a smartwatch here. Several of you around the room have got Fitbits or smartwatches or trackers. Increasingly, we're collecting data about what's going on in our bodies, about our pulse, about our heart rate, about our sleep patterns. And increasingly, when I go to learning analytics conferences, I begin to see people who are using this data and experimenting with where you can go with this data. And that's my son about 8 years ago. He's wearing a gadget which is monitoring his brain waves, and he's controlling this floating ball with his brain waves. It's moving around a maze. And that's a sort of, you could buy that on eBay for $30 or something, that sort of equipment. So it's becoming increasingly common. Is that something that you think would be useful, or is that something you'd be really scared about seeing in learning analytics? Most of our provocations assumed that we would go ahead with learning analytics because otherwise there wasn't much point to the project. But one of them was about, okay, what about if in a decade's time we stopped using them? Why might that happen, and how would we feel about it? So I don't know if anybody in this room has heard about the InBloom project. The InBloom project was a massive project in the United States, which was funded by the Gates Foundation. I think it was $100 million went into InBloom. And the idea was that it would bring together student data from many school districts into a data warehouse, and that could be analysed and used to support learners. And the Gates Foundation had consulted people around the world about good ideas on how they could spend their money, and they were really pleased with this. And they persuaded the school boards, and they persuaded the school principals. But they didn't talk to the parents. And that was a big mistake, because the parents got together and produced adverts like this. This is one of their adverts. They didn't understand what was going on. They were really worried about their children's data being taken away. They didn't know the difference between the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates. They were really suspicious about Bill Gates. And they had the idea that all data was being collected and filtered to Bill Gates, who's going to be doing something very evil with it. Now, some of their problems may have been real problems. I don't think most of them were, but the problem was the media image, and they're not taking stakeholders with you, and they're not being clear about what you were trying to achieve. All those things happen. If you now search in Bloom, if you'd searched in Bloom about 6-7 years ago, it would have been everywhere because the Gates Foundation was really proud of it. If you search it now, it's really difficult to find it. It got hidden away, swept under the carpet. We don't mention in Bloom. We've moved on. So is that a future that you see as positive, or is that a future that you don't want to avoid, and how will you avoid it? This one's around learners controlling their own data. This is one which is becoming, I think, increasingly important, because we know that data have a value, that market researchers are interested, that commercial companies are interested, that the more data sets, the more complete data sets you have, the more value they have. But who owns them? Do the learners own that data? Do they have the right to opt in and opt out? Does the institution own that data? If they've learnt collaboratively in the group, does the group own the data? This is something that's got to be sorted out, because you can't be using a resource which isn't your resource in learning analytics, so you need to think it through. Open systems are widely adopted. This is an idea around data standards. And if you've done anything with learning analytics, you've probably found out that one database in your institution doesn't talk to the other database, or the other 3 databases, or the other 6 databases. We certainly found at the Open University that none of our databases agreed about how many students we had, which you'd think was fairly basic. When I was talking to RMIT, they said none of their databases agree about how many courses they have. They've got hundreds of courses and they have no idea how many courses they actually have. So something about talking within the institution, but also something about talking more widely to other sources. So I talked to people from an Irish university. They said we spent a huge amount of money in bringing in external learning analytics tools, and we were just about ready to go, and the company went bust. But unfortunately, their company hadn't used data standards which were common across the industry, so they couldn't use any of that. So they had to, at great expense, bring in another company, which went really well for about 6 months until that company said we're going to diversify and we're moving out of learning analytics. And surprise, surprise, they hadn't used data standards either. So the university bought 3 sets of tools where really one set of tools with the correct set of standards would have got them there. We might feel positive about learning analytics. We might say that every student is going to be raised by millions of data points, and we can raise everybody's performance. But if we're going to do that, how are we going to do it? And in what ways do we want to optimise their performance? Are we going to optimise their performance in every direction, or is there some way in which we'd really like to do it? Analytics help learners to make the right choices. We'll make the right choices about what? Where are our students meeting the pinch points where they're likely to make the wrong decisions? And how can we support them to make the correct decisions at that point? What do we think are the crucial points where we'd like them to make those decisions? And the final provocation, in 10 years' time, analytics will largely have replaced teachers. And you do find people who are working on systems which they reckon could do this. You know, student does something, system reacts, the system goes, well, if you don't know this, you need this piece of content, now work on this piece of content. I find that a fairly nightmarish situation. I think educators have all sorts of important roles, and I wouldn't like to see that happening. But if we don't want to see that happening, we have to dissuade people who are working on that. Or if we think it's important in some situations, then we have to work towards that. So those are the 8 provocations that we were thinking about across Europe. I'd like to just introduce some new provocations that I heard about at the conference last week, because last week in Sydney was the big Learning Analytics annual conference, and one of the keynotes, Neil Selwyn from Monash University. Neil Selwyn is a sociologist who thinks about digital technologies and education, and sort of coming at learning analytics from the outside and saying, what looks weird from the outside? What might you want to change? So he came out with a list of provocations, which he produced a learning analytics wish list. You probably can't read it from there, but I've pulled out his headlines over here. Sharing the profits of learning data. You know, that's moving on from our provocation around who owns the data to actually it does have a value, and who is going to see that value. He was talking about, for example, students pooling their data and then deciding who would get access to it and on what terms they would get access to it. Now, that's not a position that we've typically taken in learning analytics. We've tended to assume that once the students at the beginning of their school, their college career or their university career clicked yes, then it's all ours and we can do whatever we want with it. Now, how would it be if the situation was reversed and every time we wanted it, we had to go and justify to the students why we wanted it and what we were going to do with it? Seeing ethics in terms of power, we've traditionally thought of ethics in terms of protecting our students, but what if we saw ethics in terms of who's got power in the classroom, who's got the power over the data, who makes those decisions? What about the transparency of algorithms? Learning analytics algorithms are typically a fairly black box thing. The data goes in and some result comes out. So does the educator know what happened? Does the student know what happened? How can we make that visible? So really interesting series of provocations. If you get a chance, I'd recommend watching the video of his keynote, really interesting keynote at LAC 18. So moving on from the provocations, we did another European project because Europe said, okay, you've got some sort of idea of what's coming up. What ought we to do about it? What sort of educational policy ought we to produce? So we ran a project called LAPE, the Learning Analytics for European Educational Policy, and we asked 3 questions. We wanted to know where learning analytics were, what might happen in the future, and how we could influence that by thinking about policy at national or international level. So we carried out a review of the academic literature to see what people were saying about deployment. Actually, people weren't saying that much about deployment of analytics. They were far too busy telling us about their individual analytics to tell us about how that played out when you really came to use them. And then we thought, well, academics, they know a bit, but they don't know everything. So let's go and look at what practitioners are doing. Let's go and look at what developers are doing. So we produced an inventory of learning analytics tools around the world, learning analytics policies, learning analytics practices. So we put that up online so we could share that with people. And then we thought, well, okay, we now know at a fairly high level what everybody's doing. Let's do a deeper dive. Let's do some case studies. So we talked to the University of Technology Sydney, we talked to the Blue Canary Company, we talked to the whole of the Norwegian education system somehow, miraculously. We talked to people networking across the Netherlands to see what people are doing in practice. Then we brought all our conclusions together and we had an expert workshop. We brought 50 experts from across Europe, practitioners, teachers, unions together to talk about what the implications were. And out of that we came up with an action for analytics series of things that could be done. Now we were proposing this for a European level, but actually the steps within it you can do at a national level, a state level, even an institutional level, because the framework remains pretty much the same. In all cases you need a strategy, you need some research and development, infrastructure, context standards, skills and outreach. So I'll take you through that And you can think about where you are in that, where you might like to be, which bits you've covered, which bits you haven't covered. In terms of strategy, as I said, you need to be aligning your work on learning analytics with what your organisation is trying to do, because if you're working at cross purposes, you're never going to get very far, because your institutional leaders, your people with money, are going to be pushing for their objectives over your objectives. So you need to think about alignment there. And you need a roadmap for where you are going, rather than a sort of day-to-day, this is our project today, we've got a little project. Where are you going over the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years? And you need somebody who's got responsibility. And the higher up the organisation you can go with somebody who's got responsibility, the more chance you have of succeeding, because you do need quite a lot of changes to take place. It's not just a question of you need some resource, you need somebody who's willing to say, okay, that database doesn't talk to that database. I accept they've never done that for 30 years, but they are going to in the future. So you need somebody fairly high up to be making those sorts of decisions. You need opportunities like this, like conferences, like academic papers, like practitioner presentations, to talk about what is going on and how you can share practice. And this can't be a one-off procedure. It can't be, here is our 5-year plan, at the end of our 5-year plan, that's it, we will have learning analytics, all is good. You need to be thinking about it at every stage. How is it going? How is it changing? How are our ambitions changing? There's a lot of research and development to be done in different areas. You've probably got really good pedagogies, really good learning and teaching practices, but could they be tweaked to make even better use of your learning analytics tools? Can you align them more carefully with what you're doing? Which analytics are you developing? So you might have the low-hanging fruit analytics at the beginning, the things that are easy to do, but are you working towards the more complex ones, which are what you really want to achieve in the end? You almost certainly need a bit more technology to store your data and to access your data and to help you to analyse the data. And you need some sort of framework within your institution which is helping you with this. So the Sheila project, which is one I haven't been involved in, but it's a very interesting European project, is thinking about the stages which you need to go through to roll out learning analytics within your institution. And on each level, they've got actions to take, but challenges that you're going to face, thinking about how to deal with those. In terms of infrastructure, you probably need bigger data handling capacity. You know, people say to me, let's just collect all the data. If you just collect all the data, that is a hell of a lot of data. And if you collect data over a long period of time, that is an even bigger pile of data. So where are you going to put that? You need your organisational structures in place so that it's not just pockets of people making use of analytics. You need to know how you're using them across the institution. You need people understanding why you're using them. You need people who are happy to use them and feel that analytics are solving problems for them. And so often, analytics aren't really solving a problem they had in the first place. I sometimes go to talks by learning analytics researchers and they say, I spent 18 months working this out and I now know this about these students. I said, if you'd asked the teacher in the first place, would the teacher have told you that? Yeah, probably. That was 18 months not very well spent then, was it? So you do need to be thinking about what sort of problems you're solving. And you need ways of sharing experience and good practice. And people have been talking to me about communities of practice around learning analytics. And it's good to be bringing together different institutions and sort of sharing experience. And I think one of the things we've seen coming out of the Learning Analytics Conference in Sydney is that K-12 providers there are beginning to talk together around learning analytics and build a network. This is rather a more high-level one about bringing together analytics from K-12, from universities, from practice, from training, from informal. within the institution, that's probably more about bringing them together across faculties, across disciplines, across departments, across people who are coming with different perspectives on what data is and what can you achieve with data. Because there are some departments within any institution where people are really happy working with numerical quantitative data and solving problems with it. And there are other departments who are really not happy with doing that and see lots of problems. And so understanding each other's perspectives and sharing that, and developing practices. This one about identifying successful financial models tends to get a bit pushed to one side. But it is expensive to develop learning analytics. It's expensive to develop these tools and this infrastructure and train these people and change the organisation. So you've really got to think about what is the added value and can we demonstrate added value? Really added value rather than sort of theoretical, well, it might achieve something. What is it achieving and how can we do it? I talked about standards earlier. There are interoperability standards which you can use around learning analytics. XAPI is one of them, Caliper is one of them. If you're working on the tech side, that's something you need to be thinking about and knowing about. If you're not working on the tech side, you can probably ignore that. But you definitely need ethical standards. Every institution which is working with learning analytics needs to think about the ethics of this, what you're doing with the data, how you're using the data. So I come from the Open University. We pride ourselves on our work with ethics. We developed a lovely ethics policy. And then Sharon Slade, who's one of our researchers, said, okay, I'm going to go and work with a focus group of students. We've got an online focus group of students. I'll talk to them about what sort of data we're using and how we're using. So she began to talk to them about the data that's being used in the institution. And they immediately went, ooh, what are you doing with that data? Big brother, Open University. And she went, hang on, I haven't got to the learning analytics yet. This is just the basic stuff we give to the government because we always have done. But the students don't know what you're doing with the data. Students have never had to think about that before. And when they begin to think about it, they're not so happy with it unless they know why and they're involved. Another thing is the quality assurance process. Because people develop algorithms and they say, look, I piloted this algorithm, it works really well, look, I can prove to you on last year's data, look, it predicted what was going to happen. And that's fine. But 2 years down the line, 5 years down the line, you've got a different cohort of students, you've got a different educator in charge, you've tweaked the course a little bit and it's involved in a different qualification. Is it still robust? Who is checking that and how are they checking that? And if you're buying in a tool, because there are lots of commercial tools, you don't have to do all the work yourself, how do you evaluate which tools are going to work for you? And how do you do that consistently? It's another thing an institution needs to think about. In terms of skills, there are lots of people who need to be upskilled in terms of learning analytics. Educators not only need to know how to use them, but they need to know how to critique them. And they need to know how to ask for the learning analytics which will help them. So those are all things that training needs to take place in. It's no good just saying, here is a learning analytic tool, I'm going to show you how to use it. You need to go a bit beyond that. You need to think about the researchers and developers who are building these algorithms for you, asking the questions. How many of them have you got? Do you need more skills? And you need educational leaders who are really involved in implementing these changes because it involves change management and not all leaders are happy with doing that. And really importantly, you need to educate your learners to use this because not only are they going to be using analytics and data within their education, in the world of work they are going to be using this. I mean at Charles Sturt, you are training the people who are going to be the next generation of educators. They need to know how to use it, they need to know what the implications are. But in every profession, they need to know about this sort of thing. And I think a final point here is around outreach. It's not just around the people in this room who are interested in learning analytics. It's a question of, if I went out the door, and found the next person in the building and said, tell me about learning analytics, would they look completely blankly at me? Probably they would, but it's no good if they look blankly at me. They need to know what's going on, they need to be involved. It's worth talking to commercial partners. It's not something we have to do within the institution. There are commercial people working on this all the time, keen to have ideas and to develop things, and really just promoting awareness. And as a community yourselves, stay connected, keep up to date with what's going on. The Solar organisation has a lot of resources up there. It runs its annual conference. If you didn't get to Sydney, you might get to the next one, which is in Arizona. Looking forward to Arizona. Or just check the website, or check the LACE website, or the Learning Analytics Summer Institute. If you're a doctoral student or you've got doctoral students interested in this area, there is some funding available to involve them in summer institutes. The next summer institute's in New York. Again, an attractive proposition. So if you know grad students who are interested, why not involve them? I'll be putting this presentation up on SlideShare. It's not there yet, but if there are any links that you missed and you want, go and have a look at SlideShare. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Do we have any questions from the room?
Do you have any advice for some quick wins for organisations that are just starting out to collect more data and trying to make those first steps? Because quick wins will help you then to carry more staff along with you on that journey. So can you give us some case studies of quick wins where educators are working?
I'm trying to think of a case where anybody's ever had a quick win, and I'm actually failing to think of quick wins. I think the best thing to be doing is to be looking at institutions which are further down the line and talking to them about what they have achieved and how they've achieved it, and which mistakes they've made and how to avoid those mistakes. So thinking of the Open University, even though we're a distance university, we've been collecting data about our students for 50 years. We've got 50 years of survey data about them. Even then, it has taken us several years to really get to the stage where we say this is making a real difference, because there are infrastructure things to be done in the first place. We had to decide what we wanted to achieve. We had to get our data talking to each other. And that was such a big project, just unbelievably large, that you would go to people in charge of a database and say, I want to access this, and they'd go, no. And then you'd go up the line and you'd say, oh, my boss says no. And you'd have to go right the way up to the Vice-Chancellor. It was only when the Vice-Chancellor said they need to access this that you get access. So it's about thinking about those problems and learning from other people, I think. So I'm sorry not to be able to produce a quick win.
Yes.
Learning analytics sounds like a scary term to me. Isn't there an alternative?
Yeah, I can tell you what came before learning analytics: educational data mining. I think that sounds even scarier, to be honest. And there's a lot of educational data mining does go on. It's slightly less focused on the learning and slightly more focused on the data and the cool algorithms you can develop. There's also academic analytics, and academic analytics tend to focus on things that management are interested in. So management tend to be interested in the financial bottom line, how many bums on seats we've got, if we're losing too many people, and academic analytics do things around that. You can cut it down to LA, I guess. Otherwise, I think people have to struggle with the concept of learning analytics. So far, I haven't seen a more user-friendly term.
I'm wondering if you've got examples of where you were able to engage academics in learning analytics, or maybe teachers, or because often we find they're not as excited as I am learning analytics for some reason.
Yes. Yeah, if you tell people I've got a dashboard, quite a lot of people will blank over, won't they? I don't know how many of you got to the talk by my colleague Bart, which she gave earlier this week. One of the things that Bart has done is he's been talking to course teams about their LMS data. So being a distance education institution, we have sort of real-time data about what's going on in our courses. And he's been meeting with course teams about once a month and saying, look, this is what your students have been doing. Is that what you expected your students to be doing? No, we don't see very much forum activity here. Is that because there's no particular reason for them to be talking on the forum? Or conversely, are they supposed to be involved in a really heavy collaborative project and we'd expect to see them in there? What sort of actions would you want to take? When you have those sort of conversations about data, where you sort of back and forth about, well, I don't quite understand this, explain this to me, and, well, what could we do, and we can take actions now, that's the sort of thing that tends to engage people. Well, that's what we've found anyway.
Yeah, as an institution that's actually trying quite hard to collect data and make an impact with it, so we've been doing a lot of intervention processes based on data. How do we go about actually expanding our understanding or affirming that what we're doing is having an impact and measuring that impact?
Mm-hmm. I think that's something around, you need some performance indicators. You need to think about what are we trying to achieve, and once you know what you're trying to achieve, you can identify the markers which would tell you, are we achieving that? So what is it you are trying to achieve?
In this case, it's trying to come up with interventions for students across lots of different criteria, but actually measuring the intervention that's taken place has had an impact, whether it's that they've gotten back on track with their studies or they did decide to leave school and get a career, or could be welfare-based.
So one of the things you can do is you can look at previous year's data and you can compare this year's with previous years to see if there are changes in the directions you'd like. And one of the things you can do is simply talk to the students. And, you know, was that useful advice? Did you appreciate having it at that point? What could have been better? Talking to the educator, you know, what happened to the students in your class when they got this advice? How did they react to it? I think one of the things that I've seen increasingly coming out of learning analytics conferences is that when we started, everyone was talking about all this quantitative data, stats, numeric data, and gradually, one paper by paper by paper, people have begun to say, you know, we don't really quite understand this unless we understand the context, unless we're talking to people, unless we understand what the educator was trying to do in the first place. We need to collect that qualitative data and have those conversations and do that outreach and that building. And I think it's taken the field probably about 5 years to begin to come to those conclusions. Hasn't quite got there yet. It's still got the idea that when you write a paper, you tell us all about the validity and the reliability of the figures, and then we collected some opinions. And they summarise them. Haven't quite understood how qualitative research works, but heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I guess I just more have a comment or a follow up on what's been said, more so than a question. Just I wonder if as time goes by, I guess this field of learning analytics will be subsumed into this wider emergent area that we're starting to see called learner experience design, or LX design, where then it becomes less and less about the numbers and the quantitative stuff, and more about, you know, how can we use the data and the patterns emerging and so on to inform a learning design that takes into account the context, as you said.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a real dialogue to be had between learning design and learning analytics, because if you don't know what the learning was trying to do at what point, you can't interpret the analytics. And I see people sometimes say, I'm going to look at videos and I'm going to tell you if video is being used well or not. Well, you'd only know if a video is being used well if you know what the video was there for in the first place. Right? So a video isn't necessarily there to watch all the way through. Sometimes videos are telling you how to do things. So you watch step 1 and then you go and do step 1 and then it tells you step 2. Or you might be sent away to go and reflect on it, in which case, you'd probably watch it more than once. Or you might be told, go and have a look at this and see if you know it already, and then switch off if you know it already. Or you might be told to go and discuss it. Yeah? And until you know what the learners are supposed to be doing with the video, as a video, it's no more useful than being told, I've got a book in my classroom. Well, is it Spot the Dog? Is it a dictionary? Is it an encyclopedia? They're not all the same. You've got to know what people are doing with them.
Isn't AI inevitable in learning and analytics? These black boxes.
It's already there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's not inevitable. It's there.
Yeah, there's a lot of AI in there. However, if there is pressure to look inside the black box, some of these black boxes you can look inside. Some of the machine learning you can't. There's so much going on that there's no way you could unpick it. But a lot of these things could be unpicked and could be explained. And I think it's helpful if you can do that.
Yeah, I think with AI, with algorithms, with a lot of the things that we're talking about, every way of viewing or evaluating a construct has a limitation. And I think if we're circumspect, and this is what you were suggesting about a critical data literacy, I think that's the best thing that we can equip students and also educators with. No, I believe that with learning it's so complex. Causality is so difficult to ascertain because so many bits intersect to sort of shape this emergent phenomenon. It's very difficult to do, but all the different lenses that we get and an ability to critique, I think is really powerful for us as educators if we use it in the right way. I'm very excited by the potential of AI to afford insight into words, what students are thinking and the meaning making, and I think we're on the cusp of something very exciting. But again, it's about patterns. I believe the safest way to use this data is patterns at aggregate levels. For me, a concern for me is when we then use the formula to judge what Janie is going to do. I think that's our problem. Am I getting a signal? Yes? Okay. We're going to have to finish our questions, and a big thank you to Rebecca. And a gift from CSU.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You can always guarantee that you'll get one from
That's
CSU. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. That was great. That you've provided a really nice broad overview at the beginning, and it was great to have those examples. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for the questions and the comments from the audience today. It was great to have you here. We have included just a short survey. It's not digital, it's actually on paper. Yeah, how do you fill that out and how do we collect that data? Good question, we'll deal with that later. But we would like to get your feedback because this was our first community event as part of the We Imagine Data series. I will flag with you that in Wagga on the evening of April the 11th, we have a closing community event for our We Imagine Data program, where we're going to be having a panel from a range of different industries talking about how data is used across health, agriculture and other sectors, and also looking at some of the big ethical issues, some of which were touched on today. So if you would like to be involved in that, please make sure when you leave today that you just leave your name and your email address on the sign-on sheet outside, and we will definitely follow up with you. So thank you very much for your involvement today, folks, and thanks to our live stream audience. We didn't have any questions from Twitter, I think everyone's gone down to the pub early. And, yeah, we look forward to catching up with some people in our K-12 and our TAFE sector for more conversations about this, because I think we're all in a very similar situation exploring this as educators. So thank you very much, and thank you, Tim, for live streaming and keeping us connected. Thank you.